in the breaking of the bread. Risen Lord, in the breaking of the bread, show us who we are. Risen Lord, in the breaking of the bread, make us bread for your world. For you, O Lord, are the bread of life. Amen. Amen. Monique and I, and a friend of hers, and Monique's little 4-year-old son, Isaiah, stood on the sidewalk at the corner of Hanover and Keene Streets in Pottstown. Monique had just left the food pantry at the church on the corner, and little Isaiah reached into their bag of food and pulled out a long French baguette. "Look, Mom, look at this long bread," Isaiah exclaimed, as he began to brandish it about like the lightsaber in Star Wars. I admit that even as an adult, I'd done that. "Put that back in the bag, Isaiah," Monique told him. "We're going to have that at supper tonight." Monique meant that she and Isaiah and her 2 other little boys were going to make and share a meal to break bread for the first time in their new apartment. Now, Monique's journey with her boys up to this point had been long and difficult. I had first met Monique when she and the boys found themselves in the shelter for homeless families in Pottstown, where I was the director. She was fleeing a dangerous, drug-filled neighborhood in Chester, as well as an abusive spouse, hoping to make a new start with some family members in Pottstown. But, as often happens, those struggling family members could not serve as a landing spot for her and her boys. So when I met Monique at the shelter, the first thing I noticed was a young woman fiercely determined to do whatever was needed to make a new home for her family. Monique was at that time hurt and angry and ashamed, yet like a lioness wanting to take care of her cubs. She took every advantage of every opportunity in the shelter program. She followed all the rules, attended all the classes, and did her part in sharing the responsibilities of life in a homeless shelter. Imagine that, even with her 3 boys. Before her 6-month stay in the shelter ended, Monique had applied for a transitional housing program that we offered for families, which involved 2 years, 2 whole years, of volunteers walking with and working with and supporting and loving Monique and her boys as they began a new life. These volunteers were all from local churches in the Pottstown area. All were willing to offer to Monique and the boys their skills, their counsel, their presence, their love, their bread. Linda helped Monique study and prepare for taking her GED exam. Grandma Ann watched the boys when Monique had to go to job interviews. Betty showed Monique just how to dress for those interviews with clothes that had been donated by local churches. Bob helped Monique develop and learn to live by a budget when she got that job. Another friend, Tom, helped Monique learn to drive. All of these volunteers who became a new family for Monique took very seriously what we heard from the Epistle to the Ephesians this morning. In this letter, Paul urges the church to grow up into the people of God, the people that God has called them to be, always knowing that the food that sustains us is Christ. Paul pushes them and us further, insisting that by eating the body of Christ, we must become it. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth and building itself up in love. If the gospel we live in the world is going to transform the world, so must the food that we eat transform us. Risen Lord, in the breaking of the bread, show us who we are. These volunteers walking with Monique and her boys had all been fed with the bread of life in their congregations, and they understood that they were to be sharing this bread, no, becoming this bread. They particularly understood that their various callings as apostles and teachers and evangelists and all the other gifts were to be exercised yes, in their parishes, but also most profoundly in the world outside of the church walls. Risen Lord, in the breaking of the bread, make us bread for your world. In our passage from John's Gospel today, we pick up on the heels of Jesus after he has just fed the 5,000 people. And now those people are pursuing him and sticking to him like glue. The miracle of the loaves reminded the people of the manna that had sustained God's people in the wilderness. Could this man be a new Moses? Could this guy work wonders for us? Don't we often go there too? What can you do for me, Lord? So the people demanded that Jesus prove himself by making some bread from heaven rise up on the spot. Jesus knew that they needed more than that, so he gave them himself instead. Barbara Brown Taylor is an Episcopal priest, a wonderful preacher, and she says this in Bread of Angels. Give us this bread always, the people said, and that is when Jesus let them know that they were looking at it. I am the bread of life, he told them. Jesus is God's manna in the wilderness, the one who reminds us day by day by day that we live because God provides not what we want necessarily, but exactly what we need. Some bread, some love, some breath, some wine, and the relationship with this ordinary-looking man who comes from heaven to bring life to the world. But this wasn't exactly what the people had in mind. A relationship with this traveling preacher. No, they were thinking more like miracle food. They wanted good food, and maybe not just bread. Great wonders. They wanted miracles. Show us what you can do for us. Jesus corrects them even as he feeds them. It was God, not Moses, he says, who gave the manna in the wilderness. And it is God who gives the true bread from heaven, the bread that gives life to this world. Give us some of that bread, the people insist. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Now, this was probably confusing to the people, and maybe we're confused too. How exactly is Jesus the bread of life? And how is Jesus like the manna and not like the manna in the wilderness? Well, for starters, Jesus is like the manna in that through Jesus, God reminds us that we live because God provides not necessarily just what we want, but exactly what we need, like Barbara Brown Taylor says. Some food, some love, some breath, some water, some wine, and a relationship with the one who is the bread from heaven. But Jesus is markedly different from the manna in the wilderness in that Jesus feeds us through a relationship. So there's that word, relationship. Relationships can bring us joy. They can bring us pain. And they require presence and attention and much care. And yet relationships are as necessary for life as is bread. That's how we have been created. We need to be in relationship to be fully human. And God knows how fragile our relationships are, how fragile our very lives are. And God knows that we need to be continually and constantly fed. So God sends the bread from heaven in the person of Jesus. In Jesus, God comes as the bread of life, as food for the sick and the shut-in, as comfort for the bereaved and the burned out, as a living presence for the lonely and the forsaken. In Jesus, God gives us bread for the journey out of the wilderness of hopelessness and despair and estrangement, and into relationship, into community, into communion, a bread that leads us home. And what does that mean to be fed on the way home? Where is home anyway? I believe that home is the place Jesus leads us to be fully who we are in Him, fully who we are as humans, as children of God with purpose and many gifts to be offered. Travel back with me for a moment to Memphis, Tennessee in 1985. I was a young man on a spiritual journey, a quest, really. I had no idea where I was supposed to be, who I was supposed to be, how anything was going to work out, and I longed for bread for the journey. One rainy, humid summer Sunday, I found myself outside of the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd, the first Episcopal church I had entered besides going to one wedding and one funeral and one opera recital for a friend of mine. This Baptist boy did not really know what to expect, but I was drawn there. Do you know what I mean, drawn there, without really knowing why? Good Shepherd was a small parish in a really poor, tough neighborhood in Memphis. I entered and I was enveloped in quiet and the smell of beeswax and incense and prayer. You know that smell of a place where prayer is offered like incense? This is one of those places. I followed along with the man next to me in the pew with the Episcopal aerobics, and when it came time to go forward for communion, I was drawn in a way that I had never been before. I knelt at the altar rail, lifted my hands for the bread, lifted my eyes where I was surprised to see the priest looking directly into my eyes. The body of Christ, the bread of heaven, he said as he pressed the bread into my hand. It was actual bread, like what we use at Common Ground. I was home. Suddenly, and in a way I cannot explain, I knew that the Jesus that I had come to know as a little boy, this Jesus who was my friend and was as close as my breath, was giving himself to me right then and right there. Bread of heaven, bread of life. As I left the Church of the Good Shepherd that Sunday and walked down the hallway to the parking lot, I was amazed at the bulletin boards lining the hallway that illustrated all the ways this little parish was being bred for the struggling neighborhood in which they found themselves. There was a literacy group for teaching adults to read, an after-school program like the one we used to have at St. Michael's, a food pantry, a basketball club at a local park, adults reading to children in the local homeless shelter. The people of Good Shepherd were fed at the altar with the bread of life and were reaching out to be bread for their sisters and brothers. In looking at the history of the parish, I found out that in 1869 they had founded the Refuge of the Good Shepherd, which served immigrants to Memphis, especially people from China. This mission, the history reads, was a manifestation of the social gospel, which had not yet been generally accepted. Yet they were being bred for their sisters and brothers. Less than a year after my time at the altar of Good Shepherd, I found myself in Pennsylvania in the Diocese of Bethlehem, and Bethlehem means house of bread. I said that home is the place where Jesus leads us to be fully who we are in him, fully who we are as human, as children of God with purpose and many gifts to be offered. It is in this place, this parish of the Archangel Gabriel in the Diocese of the House of Bread, where I have come to understand what home is. For it is in relationship with the people of God in the pews and the chairs now, and in relationship with those God leads us to outside the walls where we come to know who we truly are. Risen Lord, in the breaking of the bread, show us who we are. I am blessed to be in relationship with Lutheran sisters and brothers through my ministry with Common Ground. For Father David and for me, they are wonderful companions. This word companion is from Latin and Old French, and it literally means one who breaks bread with another. Martin Luther says that Christ is everywhere, especially in the bread and the wine, where he binds himself and us to each other. By this we are to understand that God is to be breathed in, God is meant to be bathed in, and finally God is meant to be eaten, bread of life. God is part of the daily joyful and the heartbreaking reality of our lives, in the air, in our steps, in the sweats, in the blood, and the tears of our lives. So if Christ is everywhere, as Luther says, he is in us. We are his body now. His hands, his feet, his voice, his touch. We are the ongoing incarnation. So go out into the world to meet Monique and Isaiah and all the other children of God on the journey, remembering that you are bread. Risen Lord, be known to us in the breaking of the bread. Risen Lord, in the breaking of the bread, show us who we are. Risen Lord, in the breaking of the bread, make us bread for your world. For you, O Lord, are the bread of life.